Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the mel0n Review. Today we're going to be checking out the Incott GHero. Big thank you to mel0n, who was kind enough to send the GHero out for review. This is going to be my first time using an Incott mouse, and I'm actually quite impressed with the GHero in terms of performance, but this mouse isn't perfect and does unfortunately have some shortfalls, but we're going to talk all about the good and the bad of the mouse in this video. But before we get into it, a quick reminder that regardless of a free discount unit or affiliation with a brand, reviews here on the channel will always be unbiased. And as always, this review will be fully subtitled and timestamps will be available down in the video description. And if you enjoyed the review and want to see more reviews like this and a teardown of the GHero, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the teardown of the GHero coming up very, very soon. Alright, well let's go ahead and get started. First off, we're going to talk about the unboxing experience for the GHero, and then we'll talk about its in-game performance. The GHero comes in a very standard packaging. Inside the box we have the GHero itself, which is an asymmetrical shape similar to the Keychron M2 and the VAXI MP01 and 01S. We also have a USB-C to A cable that is tilted on the USB-N side, similar to how the Pulsar mice cables were tilted at the USB-C side, which is a great attention to detail. We also have a small USB-A to C adapter that is metal. It unfortunately doesn't have any rubber on the bottom of it, which is disappointing as it will just slide across your desk very easily and it won't anchor to anything, but this is a fairly minimal nitpick. mel0n was also kind enough to send over the 8K polling dongle for this review, which is greatly appreciated. This is normally a separate purchase of $12.99 USD, but it is compatible with both the GHero and the GHero Pro. The 8K polling dongle itself is similar in the shape to the Razer Hyper polling dongle, but unlike the USB-A to C adapter that we saw earlier, the 8K polling dongle does have rubber on the bottom, so it does anchor itself to desks significantly better than the standard A to C adapter. The GHero also comes with a separate packed set of grip tape that has this odd binary-like texture to it. I'll talk more about this grip tape and how it performs later on in this video. Overall, the GHero's unboxing experience is pretty solid, good included accessories, and the tilted USB-C end of the cable is a really nice attention to detail. I'll talk more about the cable later in this video, but for now, let's move on to the GHero's performance. Now, since the GHero is an asymmetrical or a sim ergo hybrid mouse, this mouse is very unique when it comes to its in-game performance. I've previously used similar shapes in the form of the VAXI MP01S, of course, and the Keychron M2, both of which were amazing mice, specifically the MP10S in terms of its performance tech, but the performance always felt hampered, for lack of a better word, due to the nicheness of this asymmetrical ergo hybrid shape. The same can be said here for the GHero, as the mouse just feels awkward to use in-game. I like to microcorrect with my wrist and fingers when I'm playing games, and that's very difficult to do on an asymmetrical shape, so I kept finding myself wanting to switch back to a pure ergo or a standard symmetrical mouse, as I just felt more comfortable on those shapes, and I aimed significantly better on them and more consistently on them. Another reason why I struggled to use the GHero is that the unit doesn't have a coating, so it's very slippery, so I had to rely on the included grips that did help a little bit, but the experience was less than ideal. I'll talk more about the coating and the grip tape later in this video, but I just felt off overall when I was using the GHero. I never just felt locked in when I was using the GHero, as opposed to if using a pure sim or a pure ergo mouse. But one thing I will say I'm very impressed with here on the GHero is the performance tech. The high polling rate implementation is surprisingly very well implemented. 8K did of course have some skips, but that's due to my older system, but 4 and 2K actually worked very well. The battery life is also pretty solid in 2 and 4K polling, 8K not so much, but that is to be expected. Overall, in terms of in-game performance, the GHero is a fantastic mouse on the performance tech side of things, but when it comes to actually utilizing the mouse, it's very difficult just because it's asymmetrical shape, and that's just not a shape I really like for gaming. It's just very awkward for me to use. On top of that, the lack of coating did not help the usage either. If Incott were to put the same performance tech we find in the GHero inside a pure symmetrical or a pure ergo shape, I would most likely enjoy that mouse significantly more, but the current asymmetrical shape of this mouse is just too niche for me to use. I had the same issues with the MP10S due to its asymmetrical shape, and we have the same issue here on the GHero. Now, even though this is an asymmetrical mouse, Incott has actually heavily tweaked the shape of the shell to make it a little more usable. It is definitely the more usable version of an asymmetrical shape that I've personally tried, but it is definitely heavily altered from what you'd expect from a regular asim, so let's talk about the shell a little more next. Alright, let's talk shell dimensions first. The GHero shell is measuring 118.6 millimeters long, 66 millimeters wide, which is measured at the flare of the base of the mouse. It will be thinner as you go up the body of the mouse, of course, and 38.6 millimeters tall. This is measured at the peak of the hump, and it will be shorter as you go away from the peak of the hump. As with any symmetrical mouse, the best way to describe how this mouse feels in hand is that the front of the mouse feels like a standard symmetrical mouse, while the back of the mouse feels more like the rear of an ergonomic mouse. The best mouse I can directly compare the GHero to would be, of course, the VAXI MP01S, so I'm going to be utilizing that as a comparison point for this review. In terms of the upper shell, they are very similar in the design, but you can see that Incott has tweaked the shell significantly in terms of the peak of the mouse, and and in the termination point of the hump. On the MP01S, the shell is very flat and terminates slightly towards the back of the mouse, whereas on the GHero, the shell is significantly taller and more pronounced and has a much more pronounced termination point towards the center of the mouse. This gives the GHero significantly more real estate for thenar, hyperthenar, and palm contact, but I'll talk about hand compatibility and grip compatibility in a moment. Comparing the two mice from the front, you can see, as I just mentioned, the front of the GHero's top shell is much taller than the MP01OS's shell. The sides of the mice are similar, where the front half of the mouse's sides are inwardly tilted, less so than it was on the MP01S, which is a good thing in my eyes. Comparing the rears of the MP01S and the GHero, you can see that the MP01S has a more rounded, flatter hump, while the GHero's hump is significantly taller and a little wider in terms of its termination point. And lastly, comparing the bottom of the mice, you can see that the asymmetrical flare-outs towards the back of the mice are much more pronounced on the GHero than they are on the MP01S. The left side of the mouse is also much more curved, creating a much more natural divot for the thumb to rest in than compared to the MP01S's shell. So while both the MP01S and the GHero are asymmetrical mice, Incott has heavily tweaked the shape of the GHero shell to make it much more comfortable in terms of gripping, but the mouse is still an asymmetrical shape, which, as I mentioned before, isn't a shape I personally like for gaming. It's much more usable for office use. Alright, now that we've done our deep dive into the shell, let's talk about the grip compatibility and hand contact areas next. Now, since this is an asymmetrical shape here on the GHero, the contact areas and grip compatibility is going to be very unique as opposed to what we see on an ergo and a symmetrical mouse, so let's talk about this a little more. Now, in terms of my larger 19.5 by 12.7 centimeter hands using a claw grip, the GHero is actually very well suited for my hand size in terms of gripability. The rear of the mouse, as I mentioned earlier, is taller and more rounded than it was on the MP01S, which gives a wider area for contact with palm and hypothenar, while the ergonomic flare-outs towards the rear of the GHero shell give plenty of support for the thenar region of my hand. I'd say for my hand size, the primary contact is a 50-50 split between the left region of my mid palm and the mid to upper hypothenar. On the right side of the mouse, my mid to high thenar region is supported by the tall rounded flare-out. Keep in mind though, I have very large 19.5 by 12.7 centimeter hands, so my contact areas will likely significantly differ from those on medium to large hands. Now, in terms of hand size and compatible grip styles, for small hands, maybe palm, but likely the shell is just too tall for smaller hands to fully utilize, and that is going to be the only grip you can use on this mouse. For medium-sized hands, palm or claw grip are going to be compatible, but you will need to be on the medium to large side of the scale for claw grip, and for large hands, palm or claw grip is going to be the most compatible use case here. Now, you may have noticed I didn't mention fingertip. You can fingertip the GHero if you want to with medium to large hands, but due to its asymmetrical shape, particularly the large ergonomic flare-outs on the left side of the mouse, make it very difficult to actually fingertip grip this mouse, so I'd recommend against doing a fingertip grip on this mouse unless you are very comfortable doing so. From my experience, it's just a very uncomfortable shape to try and fingertip. It's much better suited for palm and claw grips. Now, despite the shell of the GHero being the proper size for my hands, and despite the awkwardness of the asymmetrical shape, the other reason why the GHero was difficult for me to utilize to its maximum potential, I guess you could say, was the coating or lack thereof. So let's talk about that next. Now, as I just mentioned, the GHero does not have any kind of coating applied to the mouse's shell. The entire upper shell is just raw plastic, similar to what we saw on the Keychron mice like the Keychron M2 here, but the shell the GHero does isn't as grainy and has a softer feel to it. And due to the softer feeling and the lack of any real texture on the GHero shell, this mouse is extremely slippery, more so than any mouse I've reviewed so far, including the Keychron mice, as those mice had at least some granularity to the raw plastic surface. The one here on the GHero is just pure slipperiness. Now, Incott tried to account for this, as the tall rounded shell of the GHero does give you a lot of contact areas for your palm, thenar, and hyperthenar, as I mentioned earlier, so you can maintain palm anchoring decently well on this mouse due to the large contact area, but your fingers will feel very slippery across the rest of the mouse, specifically towards the front of the shell and on the sides. Now, apparently on the GHero Pro there is a coating applied to the shell, but since I just have the non-Pro GHero, I can't speak to the performance of that coating, but in terms of recommendation, I would actually still recommend getting the Pro version, as at least it has some form of coating, and that's going to be better than the slippery raw plastic here on the non-Pro GHero. Now, Incott did attempt to make this mouse grippier by including a set of grip tape in the box, so let's talk about that briefly next. Now, the GHero comes with a sheet of grips with this unique binary texturing to them. The pieces are similar to what you'd find in a universal set of grips from X-Ray Pad, but with fewer included pieces. I actually prefer the universal kit style of included grips over the gigantic pre-cut set, so I'm actually very happy to see these style of grips included. The only downside to the grips is that they are a little difficult to remove from the packaging because they stick to the plastic bag, but once you get them out, they're very easy to put back in and reapply. The included stock grips themselves are quite thin. They have a decent amount of natural stickiness, and their texturing, as I mentioned earlier, is this odd binary texturing, but with this texturing, it actually works surprisingly well, and they're actually quite good for included grip tapes. The only thing is that because the rest of the shell has no coating, you have to use a lot of the included grips to make up for the non-existent coating on the GHero here, but the grip tape does at least significantly help the lack of gripability from the mouse's lack of coating. You will of course be better off getting a third-party set of grips like the X-Ray Pads, the Kitawing 2.0s or the Geckos 2.0, but for included grips they're actually quite good, and again they do really help the usability of the GHero here and makes up for the extremely poor coating or lack thereof. Now in terms of the weight of the GHero, this mouse is definitely coming in on the heavier side of things, coming in at 61.3 grams with the stock skates included. Now Incott is advertising the GHero as weighing in around 60 plus minus 3 grams, so the 61.3 gram is well within the advertised weight spec, which is great to see. Ideally I prefer mice within the 45 to 55 gram range, but I don't mind the weight here on the GHero as the extra weight allows for some superb build quality, but I'll talk about that in a moment. In terms of weight balancing, the GHero is actually quite well balanced, slightly back heavy, but nothing I noticed that was impacting my usage in any way. Overall, the weight and balancing are very well executed, which is really nice to see here on the GHero. Again, I would love to see more in the 55 gram range, but that is a very, very minimal nitpick. Oh, and regarding the weight of the GHero Pro, Incott is saying that mouse is going to weigh in around 66 plus minus 3 grams due to its larger battery. So I'm going to assume that mouse is going to weigh in more around the 67.5 gram range. So definitely heavier than the regular GHero, but again, you are getting a coating and a bigger battery, which I will talk about a little more later. Alrighty, now in terms of build quality here on the GHero, overall this unit is actually very, very well built. As I just mentioned, the extra weight is justifying some extremely solid build quality here, kind of similar to what we saw in the Vaxi mice, the same concept where that mouse was very heavy but had great build quality. Same thing here on the GHero. There is no creaking, flexing across the entire upper shell of the mouse. The base does flex if you put weight on it, but only if you put direct pressure on it, which is pretty common for most mice, so that's completely fine. Overall, I'm actually very impressed with build quality. I did not expect it to be this good on this mouse, and I'm actually very impressed. In terms of the unit QC here on the GHero, the unit is also perfectly QC'd. All the buttons of the scroll wheel feel very well implemented, no issues that affect any usage in any way. The only oddity I noticed about this mouse is that the piece of plastic that separates the main click is a little taller on the left side than it is on the right side, but this is purely cosmetic and won't impact performance in any way as I mentioned before, but I wanted to still mention it regardless. But overall, big props to Incott here. The QC and build quality on the GHero are extremely impressive, and I'm going to assume they're most likely going to be just as good on the GHero Pro, if not better. Alrighty, let's talk about the main clicks next. Now the GHero is using the standard 1.0 blue shell pink dot switches that we see pretty much everywhere. I'll give you a quick little sound test here. The shell buttons themselves are a slightly convex design. They're actually one for one with the design of the main buttons on the MP1OS, which is quite interesting. They are the same non-coated plastic as the rest of the GHero shell, so they do become quite slippery during use. I'd recommend using a lot of the included grips or the aftermarket grips to help with the gripability. It would have been nice to see some kind of indent on these, but it is what it is. The main buttons are extremely well stabilized. There's little to no play on either side of the main buttons. The main buttons are also indented into the shell, so you don't have to worry about any interference from your fingers resting on the side of the mouse, which is a lovely attention to detail. In terms of the main clicks feel, the main clicks do have a surprising amount of pre-travel, which is a little odd, but I'll talk about why that is in a moment. The main buttons do have a fairly low amount of post-travel though. They have decent rebound, but the high post-travel does hamper this a little bit. The main button click does feel consistent across the entire shell click, which is a great thing to see. Now the odd thing about the main clicks here on the GHero is that the pre-travel is a little variable. What I mean by that is that without a finger resting on the top of the click, the pre-travel is extremely high, but then with a finger laying on it, it becomes lower. It's very odd. I can't say I've ever seen this on any mouse before. It's almost like the switches pre-travel and post-travel have been swapped, where commonly the post-travel you feel on a switch varies a little bit depending on how hard you press down. Here it's just kind of the opposite, which is very, very odd. One other noteworthy thing about the main clicks here is that the default debounce for this unit on the GHero is set to 8 ms, so I would recommend adjusting that via the software before you actually use the GHero in game. Overall though, it's a decent main click implementation, definitely a little odd with the variable pre-travel, but regardless in its oddness, it won't significantly impact your usage here on the GHero, and the clicks do feel very good all around. Alright, now let's talk about the side clicks next. Now these are rather unique as the side buttons here are actually 1.0 green dot buttons, which we commonly see used for DPI buttons, rarely ever side buttons, but regardless of the odd switch choice here on the GHero, the side buttons actually feel surprisingly good. I'll give you a quick little sound test here. Now the side buttons themselves are these larger, slightly rounded, flattened pill-shaped buttons. They use the same raw plastic as the rest of the GHero shell and the main clicks, which means they can be kind of slippery to use sometimes. Again, it's recommended to use grip tape here to help with the gripability of the side buttons to make them more consistent to actuate. In terms of the side buttons feel, the side buttons have a slight bit of pre-travel and a lot of post-travel. The buttons have an okay rebound, but it's not as strong as the main clicks, but decent enough to make the side buttons still usable. Similar to the main clicks, the side buttons are very well stabilized and there's very little play to either side of the side buttons, which is great to see. Overall though, a solid implementation. The side buttons do lack that spammability that you'd find on 1.0 white dots that we commonly see used for side buttons, but they're still completely fine for use from my experience, just a little lacking in the spammability aspects. Alright, next up let's talk about scroll wheel and scroll wheel click. Now the scroll wheel has this tire-like texturing to it, but with a plastic ring running through the center for the RGB lighting that is inside. This is primarily used for DPI indication and battery and that kind of stuff. The scroll wheel itself is actually decently grippy and very easy to scroll. Inside, the GHero is using a TTC 10mm encoder, which is the exact same encoder we found on the Vancer Groove, which means that the scroll here is going to be extremely light in terms of its scroll force with very slightly pronounced scroll points. And because of this, just like we found on the Vancer Groove, this super light scroll wheel with the minimal feedback from the scroll points causes the scroll wheel to be extremely easy to accidentally actuate when trying to scroll wheel click, so much so where you have the same issues that the Groove did, where whenever you're trying to do a scroll wheel click, you'll just accidentally scroll and switch weapons or something, which is a very big issue specifically for gameplay usage. The scroll wheel click is using the same switch as the side buttons, which is a 1.0 green dot switch, but I actually do like the lighter scroll wheel switch as opposed to the normal scroll wheel switches where they're very high in their actuation weight. So having a slightly lighter one here on the GHero is a welcome change, but the scroll wheel still being so light and so easy to misactuate is still a big issue and does heavily impact the usage here on the GHero. If the scroll wheel encoder was the TTC 11 or 12mm encoder with more pronounced scroll points, the scroll wheel would be a 10 out of 10 for me, but its current iteration is difficult to recommend due to the scroll wheel issues. Alright, now in terms of the sensor and the MCU here on the GHero, we have the standard 3395 DMT6QU PixArt sensor. This is an unlocked version of the sensor with a max DPI of 26,000. The sensor does also have the ripple, angle snapping, and motion sync enabled and can be turned on or off via the software. In terms of the MCU, we do have a rather unique MCU choice here. The GHero is actually using the PixArt PAR2682QN MCU. This is an MCU I personally haven't seen on any mice, but it actually was used by the Glorious mice on the Glorious i2. Now, when it comes to unique MCUs, I always put a little bit of an asterisk next to any kind of performance claims, as it's not a Nordic MCU and I don't trust the marketing, and unfortunately I don't have a way of verifying the click latency and that kind of stuff here. In regards to my personal experience, I had no issues with the performance. It was completely fine. I didn't notice that the clicks were slower than anything else. It was pretty fine, on par with everything else I've tried so far, but just take any marketing claims from Incott here with a bit of a grain of salt. Alright, now in terms of the connectivity here on the GHero, on the non-pro model, the mouse supports wireless 2.4 GHz and wired USB-C connectivity. Now for my usage here on the GHero, I primarily tested the wireless, which worked perfectly fine, even on the high polling rates. I did also do some testing on the wired connection since the stock cable has that angled tilt at the USB-C end, and the wired performance was actually very good and I didn't run into any problems, but you will be capped to 1K polling over the wired connection. You will not be able to utilize the 2, 4, 8K polling, which is disappointing, but given the MCU here on the GHero, that is understandable. Overall, the connectivity here on the GHero is well implemented, no issues with the performance. Also, one other side note, the stock cable is very good. As I mentioned earlier, it has the tilted USB-C end, and the cable is actually pretty low in terms of its rigidity. It's very flexible, very good for wired use. I had no problems during usage. The only issue with it is that sometimes it's a little thick, so it doesn't fit in all bungees. Overall, though, it is a very good stock cable with a great implementation in terms of the tilted USB-C end, which is lovely to see. Now, I wanted to talk quickly about the stock skates here on the GHero. To my dismay, these are the exact same stocks that I found on the Vancer Groove and the Vancer Thrash. I believe these are BTL stocks, but I'm not 100% sure. Regardless of who makes them though, these are just incredibly soft, super controlled skates that perform horribly. I just absolutely hate this skate type. I don't know why companies keep using them, but they're just really bad. I'd much rather see Incott use those thin dyed PTFE skates we commonly see on budget mice rather than these BTL stocks, because they'd be significantly better. To be completely honest with you, once I realized that these were the same ones from the Vancer mice, I just removed them and replaced them with the X-Ray Pad J Donut skates, as those are my preferred skate type, and they perform significantly better here on the Incott GHero, and they also help to cut down the weight of the mouse due to their speedy nature. I don't don't know what set of skates the Pro version is using. I'm going to assume it's going to be the exact same one. So again, if you're going to pick this mouse up, either the regular edition or the Pro edition, be sure to get yourself an aftermarket set of skates so you don't have to suffer with the stock ones. My personal recommendations are the X-Ray Pad Jade or Obsidian Donut skates. Those are the best ones I've tested, and they work the best here on the Incott GHero. Alrighty, and in terms of the battery here on the GHero, the normal version I have here is using a 300 milliamp hour battery, while the Pro version is going to be using a 500 milliamp hour battery. Now, the 300 milliamp hour battery here obviously doesn't hold out too well when it comes to the higher polar rates, specifically 8K and 4K, so the battery life is going to be heavily impacted. Now, unfortunately, since the software for the GHero does not accurately give a readout of the battery life, it was pretty much impossible for me to get an estimate of the battery life I had here on the GHero. I had the GHero running on 8K hertz for like 2 hours, and the software still said the mouse was plugged in and fully charging. That is something I would like to see Incott fix on their future versions, just because the software not reading out the battery life is very, very frustrating. Again, with the change of the battery life, the Pro version having the bigger one, and because both of these mice do support 8K pulling rate, yet another reason to go for the Pro version, because it's going to have a bigger battery. Yes, it's heavier, but it does have the coating and a bigger battery, which is going to play much, much nicer with the 4 and 8K pulling rates available here on the GHero. All right, now let's talk about the software here. Now, the Incott software for the GHero is actually surprisingly good, but does have some odd quirks. The software does default to Chinese, so you do need to swap the language to English via this button at the bottom left corner, but once you swap the language, the software is very, very easy to navigate and very straightforward. The software has tabs for rebinding all the keys on the mouse, and there is a way to disable and change what the function of this top button does, which is a great attention to detail. There is also a tab for changing the polling rate, the DPI settings, LOD, disabling or enable motion sync, angle snapping, or ripple. There is also a full macro editor and settings to adjust the sleep timer on the mouse and the debound setting, which is great to see. And there is also a way to import and export profiles via INI files in the software, which is a great feature as well. Now, one interesting feature that the Incott software does have is that there is a setting for the sensor mode where you can swap it between low power, high power, and corded/wired. Now, from my testing, there doesn't seem to be any difference between these settings, at least not that I can see. Maybe on the GHero Pro there's more of an impact, but on the regular GHero these settings don't appear to do anything. The only issue I guess you could say I have with the Incott software is that, as I mentioned earlier, the battery life indicator is rather inaccurate and doesn't display the battery life accurately at all. And also there's no numerical value to the battery indicator, which also makes it extremely difficult and impossible to actually give a metric on battery life drain, which is another thing that I would like to see fixed. But aside from that, the software is actually quite good. Very, very impressed overall. No real major complaints aside from the things I just mentioned. Alrighty, and lastly, let's talk about repairability. Now, this is one area I'm actually very, very impressed with here on the GHero. This unit is incredibly easy to open and very, very easy to service. Easy to swap components and to clean this out. It also does have a ribbon cable for the side buttons instead of a force connector, which was on the Venture mice. So it's nice to see a mouse that's half the price of that mouse actually have proper build quality, which is great to see. Overall, really no complaints about the serviceability. It's a very, very serviceable mouse, which is really great to see. As always, with all the mice I cover here on the channel, I will be doing a full teardown for the GHero in a couple days after this review goes live. So if you want to see how this mouse is built on the inside and want to see how to service it or disassemble it yourself, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that video coming out in a couple days. Alrighty, well, in closing, overall the Incott GHero is a very interesting mouse, but a very confusing one. I honestly don't see this as a gaming mouse despite Incott's marketing for it. It feels much more like an office mouse that Incott slapped 8K support on for, which is again very confusing. Added the lack of coating and the reliance on the included grip tape, and the gaming usage just being kind of not that great, and the stock skates being really bad. The GHero just doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it doesn't feel like a gaming mouse at all. It feels much more like an office mouse. The GHero Pro, however, seems to be a much better overall mouse based on the differences in the specs, and the fact alone the mouse has a coating on it makes it worth it. And considering that the GHero Pro is only $59.99 USD, while the GHero is $49.99 USD, it's worth investing the extra $10 just to get the Pro version. You can also pick up the optional 8K dongle if you want to utilize the high polling rates on either the GHero or GHero Pro, but I wouldn't recommend using it on the GHero as it just nukes the battery life. Use it on the GHero Pro as that has a larger battery, but at the end of the day, both the GHero and GHero Pro are still asymmetrical mice. Definitely the most usable asymmetrical mice I've seen due to the shell changes that Incott has implemented on the GHero lineup, but they're still asyms at the end of the day, which just isn't a shape I can utilize well for gaming despite my larger hands. They feel much better for just general use office mice. If you're someone who is accustomed to asymmetrical shapes and want a larger MP101 or MP1OS shape with great performance, then the GHero Pro is the perfect mouse to pick up, but for me, I would much rather see the performance tech inside these mice be used in a pure sim or pure ergo shells. Just from my personal use cases, I'm much more consistent on those mice. The asymmetrical shape just doesn't really make a lot of sense for me. If you'd like to learn more about the Incott GHero Pro or GHero, I will have both their product pages linked down in the video description for you. But that's going to be everything for today's episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much again to MechKeys for sending over the GHero for review and the AK dongle. I greatly appreciate it. If you enjoyed the review and want to see more reviews like this here on the channel, be sure to drop a like on the video and get subscribed to the channel. If you'd like to directly support the channel, you can become a member here on YouTube. It is only $2 Canadian per month, and that is the best way to directly support the channel. You can also support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 at MechKeys, Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming, TJ Exclusives, and a couple other retailers. My code will save you a couple dollars on your orders, and all the money will directly support the channel. So thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.